Hello, my name is Chris and today I'd like to talk a little bit about the links between smoking and depression and what that means for those of us who want to quit smoking whilst dealing with a pre-existing mental health condition or a history of mental health conditions like depression. I want to talk about why cigarettes don't quite have the antidepressant qualities that some people think that they do, and why self-medicating with cigarettes isn't really doing us as much good as we think. I want to talk about why smoking may actually be increasing, exacerbating, making our depression worse, and therefore why quitting smoking can help us alleviate that depression once and for all. I know there's, if we are struggling with depression, the temptation is there to say, well, I really want to quit smoking because I know I should, but I'm also really struggling with my mental health, so I'm going to sort my mental health out first and then quit smoking. And I absolutely understand the logic in that. However, the more we look into it, the more it becomes apparent that smoking is actually making our mental health worse. So if we take the cigarettes out of the equation first, then we stand a much greater chance of improving our mental health in the long run. I want to talk about all of that in today's video, but before I do, just a quick reminder, the next live stream hangout will be Saturday, March 27th at 6:30 p.m. UK time. My American friends, I think you're about 4 or 5 hours behind. If you don't want to miss that, I have put a link up where you can get a notification that will remind you when the live stream is about to start. I'm not sure if I can put that in the cards above. If I can, you'll see it there. If not, it will at least be down in the description below. So that's March 27th. On the last live stream that we did on February 27th, a lot of people, we had this conversation about mental health and quitting smoking, and I promised to dive deep into it for you, and I have at length. So I'm probably going to make a couple of videos on this subject, starting with this one today about the links between smoking and depression, and why quitting smoking can actually help us improve our mental health. The first thing that we need to be clear on is that there is definitely some kind of relationship between smoking and poor mental health. There is definitely a link between smoking and depression. You can pile through any amount of studies that have been done and they will show some kind of link and some kind of relationship. What isn't so clear and what not all the experts seem to be fully in agreement on is which way round that link actually goes, like how that relationship works. There is one school of thought which is that whatever it is that makes us prone to depression, whatever is, whether it's external circumstances or something within ourselves that makes us more likely to become depressed, also makes us more likely to form addictions and self-sabotaging behaviours like smoking. In other words, if you are already depressed or you already have that thing within you that means you could become depressed, then you are more likely to also smoke. If you took 100 people who smoke and 100 people who have never smoked, you will find more people with depression in the smoking group than the non-smoking group. And one theory put forward as to why this is that people with depression were using cigarettes for their antidepressant qualities, using cigarettes to get the dopamine hit to make themselves feel better. This was just a theory. There wasn't an awful lot of evidence to say, yeah, this is definitely why depressed people smoke. But there is actual evidence, which I'll get to later in this video, that smoking doesn't have the kind of antidepressant qualities that we think it does, and that it isn't actually improving our mood at all, at least not in the way that we think it does. However, I can totally see where this theory would come from. I can absolutely understand the logic behind that argument. You know, I spoke in many of my other videos about using cigarettes to change the way that I felt. You know, whether I was glad, sad, mad, feeling bad, it didn't matter. If I wanted to change the way I felt, I smoked a cigarette. Turned out it didn't do all that much good for me, you know, like the more I think about this and the more I talk to people who are quitting smoking, you know, they'll say, well, I was stressed and I smoked a cigarette. And I say, well, did the cigarette really get rid of the stress? Well, no, I still felt shit afterwards. So it doesn't really do much for us, but I can see that argument, right? There is another school of thought which says that rather than being depressed making you more likely to smoke, smoking makes you more likely to be depressed. And if you already have depression, it's more likely to make it worse. That smoking increases, exacerbates, just amplifies the depression. So if you don't already have depression, you may be more likely to develop depression if you're a smoker. And if you do have depression, then smoking is more likely to make it worse. And I laugh then, and it's not to trivialize the situation, it's just that when I read this, it was like, oh my goodness, it just makes so much sense why I felt so miserable for so long in my own smoking journey. And again, there is no concrete, this is why this happens. Most experts seem to say that it's to do with the way smoking affects our neurotransmitters. And one theory put forward relates to dopamine. That although we smoke we get that quick, sharp bit of dopamine, what's actually going on when we do this is that we're encouraging the brain to minimize or completely switch off its own dopamine producing capabilities. It's like we have a dopamine factory in the thing, something in our brain goes, no, closing down production, all done. And again, this makes sense, especially if you put it in the context of the kind of depression that we can feel after we quit smoking. I made that video about dealing with post-quit depression or dealing with depression whilst you're quitting. Again, in the card or in the description below. And if you think about it in that context, it absolutely makes sense. If by smoking we are messing with our neurotransmitters and causing the brain to shut off its production of dopamine, and the only kind of pleasure response we get comes from cigarettes, then we also take away the cigarettes, it's no wonder we feel so awful. The good news is, of course, that the brain will eventually realise, hang on a minute, we're not smoking anymore, we need to get all the people back and start the factory up again and get the dopamine producing. That does happen. Of course, the question is, how long does it take? In fact, I posted, when I was doing my research, I posted this in our Finding Freedom group, and someone said, well, how long does it take to get the dopamine back? The honest answer, and this is not the answer that you want from me, but the honest answer is that I don't know. I looked around, I dove deep, I tried to do all the research and find any kind of thing that will say, well, dopamine production kicks off again in like 2 or 3 weeks or a month or whatever. I haven't found that yet, but I also haven't given up looking. And I don't want to stand here and bullshit you, basically. I don't want to, I could make a guess, but I would rather have something to back that up before I tell you oh, your dopamine will kick back in 3 weeks, you'll be fine. But what we do know is that it absolutely does kick back up. That depression does pass, it does lift, if it's caused by smoking or quitting smoking. Of course, and I will say this at the end of the video as well, if you are really struggling with depression and things aren't getting better, please reach out and seek help in whatever way that works for you. Before we go any further, if you're wondering where I'm getting all this information from, if you go to chrisscoyles.com/smoking depression, all one word, smoking depression, I've done a link dump of all the studies, all the articles, all the bits of things that I've read about smoking and depression, everything that's informing what I'm telling you today, so that you can do your own research and check, that what I'm saying is valid if you wish to. In reading all those studies and those articles, I also found that there's another school of thought, which is that the relationship between smoking and depression isn't just one way. It isn't just that smoking makes you more likely to be depressed, and it isn't just that being depressed makes you more likely to smoke. It's actually both. The more depressed you are, the more likely you are to smoke. The more you smoke, the more your depression increases. The more your depression increases, the more you smoke, the worse your depression gets. So on and so on, in this awful, awful vicious cycle. Things just getting worse and worse and worse. I can remember being in this cycle myself for the longest time until I decided to finally break it, and found that the best way to break that vicious cycle was to take cigarettes out of the equation. Now, I've dealt with my own depression and mental health issues since I was 16, and I'm an old man now, so it's been a long time for me. And it wasn't that quitting smoking was a magical cure and I felt better and I haven't had a bad day since. I have. But when my mental health is off these days, the periods last for much less time than they used to and are much less severe than they used to. And when I'm feeling good, I feel so much better than I ever did as a smoker. And it's also important to mention that if we are using cigarettes for their antidepressant qualities, if we are using cigarettes to self-medicate, then it's probably not doing for us what we think it is doing. There's actually very little evidence that smoking can make us feel better if we feel bad, if our mood is bad. There was a study done by a team at Hines Hospital in Illinois, and they were looking at this theory, this idea that people with depression smoke to self-medicate, and they found that there was actually very little evidence to prove this theory, so they did some research into it themselves. They actually found that in smokers with depression, smoking could actually enhance the response to a positive mood trigger. So they took people who had depression and who smoked, and they gave them something to elicit a positive mood, and then those people smoked a cigarette and the positive response to that trigger increased. Which you think, well, Chris, that flies in the face of everything that you've said. We might as well all go and smoke because it can make us feel better. No, we have to look at what's really going on here. It wasn't just, if you put a smoker in a room with no stimulus, with nothing going on, and they felt bad and they smoked a cigarette, they didn't feel better. What they did is they took something else that improved their mood, and smoking a cigarette enhanced that just a little bit. And again, that's something that makes sense to me. I can think about when I smoked and I'd have a nice meal, right? Just a really satisfying meal. The kind of meal that tastes so good, leaves your belly full and just makes you want to take a nap. and you go, yeah, that was a good meal. Now I'm going to go and have a cigarette. And that after meal cigarette was like, oh, that's the spot, right? So I can absolutely get that it can enhance that the response to the positive mood trigger, but the positive mood trigger had to be there. So there is no reason why we still can't take the cigarettes out of the cake. Come on, Chris. Why we can't take the cigarettes out of the equation, just have the positive mood trigger. It might not make us feel elated, it might not make us feel euphoric, but it's going to elicit some kind of positive mood and get us on track to starting to feel better. A few years later, there was another team, and the only word that I can remember is a guy's name called Kenneth, so I'm going to check my notes on my phone. It was Kenneth Perkin, PhD, and his colleagues at the University of Pittsburgh. Thank you, phone. They wanted to see, knowing that smoking could enhance a response to a positive mood trigger, they wanted to see if smoking could improve mood in people who were negative, if it could improve a response to a negative stimulus, to a negative mood trigger. And they found that it didn't really. What they found was that a cigarette could improve someone's mood if they hadn't had a cigarette since the day before. That was the only way that it really had any benefit. A cigarette really only improved someone's mood if there was a period of abstinence before it. And again, that makes sense. But I don't think that what this is saying is that cigarettes actually improve your mood, or that we gain anything from smoking. All that is doing, when I think about it, all that is doing is ending those low-level withdrawals. It's ending that low-level discomfort that comes from going from any period of time without a cigarette. It's not making us feel, it's not doing anything positive for us, it's just ending that low-level discomfort, And we know ourselves, if we don't smoke for 7, 8, 10, 12 hours and then smoke, it's probably more enjoyable. But it's not enjoyable because there's anything positive in the cigarette. It's only enjoyable because we're no longer craving, we're no longer, starved of nicotine. And besides, that guy Kenneth Perkins, PhD, and his team also looked to see how smoking would, affect a person's mood in other negative situations. So they showed slides designed to elicit a negative mood. They got people to do public speaking and challenging computer tasks, and seeing how a cigarette impacted their mood, and found that it kind of didn't really. It was only the period of abstinence that made a cigarette improve a person's mood. In all of the situations, it didn't really do anything at all. So, if you're thinking of using a cigarette to self-medicate, it's not really doing what you think it's going to do. There was another study done by a team at the University of Montana, and they looked into expectations and how expectations and beliefs impacted the way that people felt after smoking. And this was really interesting. What they found was that, if a person believed that they were going to feel better after a cigarette, they generally did. But if a person believed that they were going to feel better after doing anything else, they generally did. So it wasn't the cigarette that was making them feel better, it was the person's own beliefs, the person's own expectations. You know, saying, okay, I'm going to feel better, and they did. You know, it wasn't the cigarette itself. You know, we can say, well, I'm going to have a cigarette and feel better, and then they did. We can say, well, I'm going to hop on one leg and then I'll feel better, and the same result would apply. This, such good news for smokers with depression, because it means we don't need the cigarettes to feel better. The cigarettes, if you like, are just a kind of placebo. We can replace cigarettes with anything else in the world and produce the same results. Because what this study shows us is that this feeling better comes from our own mindset. And that's not for me to dismiss this down into, oh, if you're depressed and thinking of smoking, just think positive and you'll be okay. As an ex-smoker and as someone who's struggled with my mental health for many years, you know, I'm not going to, I absolutely know that there is much more to it than that. But it does show us that we don't need those smokes. It's funny, I was working with someone yesterday and we were talking about how, you know, for every benefit that you think you gain from cigarettes, you can probably list 5 other ways to gain that same benefit, you know, without harming us, without harming yourself, without polluting your own body. And that is good news. The next video I'm going to make in this little smoking and mental health series will look at how to actually navigate that quit whilst dealing with the mental health. What I've wanted to stress today is that smoking doesn't help. Doesn't help if you're smoking, what am I trying to say? Smoking doesn't help if you are depressed, and it's probably only going to make that depression worse. There was another study that I haven't put in a link dump because, to be honest, I forgot about it until right this very moment, but it said that when they looked at how depression impacted people quitting smoking, it didn't really seem to have an impact. So even if you are struggling with depression, it is still possible to quit smoking. And there is lots of support out there for you, including our own Finding Freedom group, facebook.com/group/findingfreedom1, where there is this wonderful community of people at all stages of their quit journey. Some who quit years ago when we first started this, some who were just at the very beginning, all supporting each other, encouraging each other in the successes, in the not so good stuff, and everything in between. Next time, like I say, we'll talk about how to navigate that quit, but for now, thank you so much for watching. Of course, it wouldn't be a video if I didn't give you a quick plug of my book. It is called Quit Smoking and Be Happy. If you like the kind of stuff that's in this video, you'll more than likely enjoy this book. You can get it from Amazon in print and ebook form, and the links are in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you next time. Goodbye.